I'm thrilled that we have Aram Calhoun, Professor Emerita at the University of Maine in Orono, and her research focuses on the conservation of forested wetlands and vernal pools, and we'll be hearing about that work today. So Aram, take it away.
Great, thank you very much. If people want to put their video on, I rather talk to people than black boxes. So thanks, Deb, for staying on. It's nice to see a face. So I was asked to give a talk on vernal pools today, and I rudely said, well, no, I'm not willing to do just the regular, yay, we love amphibians and frogs, here's their life histories, because I'm on a mission that I've been on for the last 15 years of actually doing something to help conserve these species, and it's been a long, hard row. So what I want to do with you folks today is a little bit about what a vernal pool is, but more importantly, to their conservation, I want to share with you some take-homes that we've learned from 25 years of researching these amphibians, and a new method that we've come up with to conserve them in a way that is long-term and viable. So I'm going to give a brief introduction to vernal pools, give you some background, and then launch into some solutions. So this is going to be a conservation makeover because I feel like current conservation activities haven't really hit the mark. So just to remind you what vernal pools are, they are seasonally flooded ephemeral wetlands. They're generally very small, and a lot of them are beyond the regulatory network of the Army Corps. They have no permanent inlets or outlets, and this is important because there aren't breeding fish or breeding bullfrogs and green frogs, which all are able to eat the amphibians and their eggs, because that don't have chemical or physical defenses against fish and some of the permanent pond frogs. So the key feature here to keep them fishless and to keep back permanent amphibian breeding habitat is the fact that they fill about this time of year as we have melting snows and groundwater is still high because the leaves haven't come out on the trees yet, but they generally dry down by the end of summer. They don't have to, but they dry down, or they dry out completely, or they dry every other year, or they dry 80% of the way in their sort of semi-permanent pools. So there can be different hydro periods. But the key is, again, no fish and no permanent populations of what we consider the permanent pond amphibians, like bullfrogs and green frogs. These host a number of animals adapted to temporary wetlands, including the charismatic fairy shrimp, which can be up to an inch in size. And we're working at pools throughout the state, and students are going out and trying to find these pools because we just don't have enough information on this species. The wood frog, which sounds like the quacking ducks in the woods, this is one of the first signs of spring that people get excited about. And then two mole salamanders, so called because they live in underground burrows, mostly of shrews in this state. And so you don't see them generally unless you're in breeding season or you're out in the woods in the middle of the summer and it's raining and they might come out to forage, but they're underground, so they're called mole salamanders. There's the spotted salamander and the blue spotted complex. I hope all of you have been able to meet these animals in your travels. We're right on the cusp of the time of year that they make their way to breeding pools before the ice is even off of the pools. And they will come down, and if the pond is frozen over, they'll just stand in line. They're very anxious. Once snow starts melting and it warms up a little bit, these animals literally thaw, especially the wood frogs, and then they make their way to the pools to breed. And since they're seasonal wetlands, everything is on a speeded up to develop before the pool dries. If you're interested in getting involved, on our webpage of Pools and People, if you go to Want to Get Involved, There's a whole volunteer program for Big Night folks. It was developed by Greg LeClaire. Here's his email. And what they do is they help all over the state with migration of animals across the roads during Big Night. And Greg LeClaire is collecting data on all of the roadkills and species to help get a handle on where there are roads that perhaps need some remediation, to get a handle on populations and how many animals we're losing, and to help them across. So take a look at that. It's an exciting time of year amphibian-wise. So moving on to the vernal pool ecosystem, just to get away from the very fascinating but not enough time life history of the animals themselves, we need to start thinking about vernal pools in a landscape context. So I want to touch on a few things that vernal pools contribute to the broader forested ecosystems in which they are embedded. So they have a hydrologic connection. So here is a dry pool in Acadia National Park, and it's dominated by sedges. Vernal pools can be any wetland type, shrub, sedge, forested. It's just that they have the temporary hydrology. But they can be recharge areas in the summer, recharging groundwater. They can be discharge areas where groundwater seeps out and into the pool. They can be connected to other wetlands underground. So this concept of them as isolated wetlands really bothers me because they are hydrologically connected one way or another, and they have hydrologic functions. The other important thing is this is the collection of one pitfall trap, and that's a bucket that we sink in the ground. We put drift fences around pools to look at animals as they're coming in and going out. This is how we count and mark animals. This is just from one bucket in one night, just to give you an idea of the density of animals leaving the forest as they're coming into the pools to breed on Big Night. This is a lot of carbon, and it goes into the pool, but just as much comes out of the pool. All those animals leave and the juveniles leave. So there's a lot of carbon exchange between the forest and the wetlands. Here is a pool a couple of summers ago. You may remember we had a drought in the beginning of the summer, and then we had rain. A lot of pools lost their egg masses because of that drought. But this is carbon. This is food. So I try to tell people, don't go filling up the pool or moving the eggs. There are a lot of animals that are keyed into the timing of vernal pools, and this is a huge carbon asset at a time when things are very hungry. So these eggs were gone by the next day, being consumed by animals. And then on the other end, if pools dry too soon, all of these bodies contribute nutrients to the forest floor litter in the pool, and all those nutrients are what help the pool be so productive the next season. So there's a lot of carbon import and export going on between forests and their pools. And here's an example of animals from the forest using the pools as feeding stations. I have highlighted in yellow things that wetlands would find interesting about pools, is that they provide food for all of these animals that a lot of people use for hunting purposes. So we actually, one other thing, especially from folks down your part of the world, Blanding's turtles and spotted turtles, there have been many studies done on vernal pools, not on vernal pools, but on these species that ended up in vernal pools because they use a network of vernal pools as a very important part of their life history. So there's lots of connections that we may not even know about now. So it's wildlife habitat for things other than those specialized breeding amphibians. So we had a student, she put camera traps around a number of vernal pools around the Bangor area. And we've discovered that these are really fast food oases for either dining in or dining out. We have camera traps showing ducks coming in and eating egg masses in the spring. This is a bear family at the end of the summer taking advantage of green vegetation. Fox and a fisher in the winter around a pool. And I have this is from my backyard pool. We have owls and hawks coming down and taking out frogs and salamanders. bobcat. So that's just an example of the variety of what we think of forest creatures. They're all keyed into the cycles of vernal pools and taking advantage of them. And if you're not interested in eating in, we have fast food takeout. So a lot of our animals, unfortunately, we know about these because they're beeping. We have transmitters on them, and my students have found frogs in beeping hawks and owls and in snakes. So these amphibians move into the forest, and there's lots of predators that are waiting for them and dependent upon them. So that's just a little glimpse of the role that vernal pools have in a greater terrestrial environment beyond the classic breeding habitat. So I'm going to give a little preview of the science behind the management strategies that I want to share with you today. We've studied about vernal pool ecology in the pools. Lots of scientists have done this, so we really do know a lot about that. This is one of my grad students who really got into vernal pools literally and figuratively, and discovered new ways for counting egg masses and so forth. But where the real gap is what we call the post-breeding habitat, because we can't manage landscapes until we understand what these amphibians actually need in their post-breeding habitat. And it's convenient to call them vernal pool amphibians, but unfortunately, they all have slightly different life histories. They live different lengths of time. So they're not easy to manage for because everybody needs something a little different. So the wood frogs and the mole salamanders, they both overwinter or hibernate in upland forest. But the blue spotted salamanders and the wood frogs in central and southern Maine prefer forested wetlands, whereas the spotted salamander prefers well-drained upland forests. And juveniles, we don't know what they're using. They're very hard. We can just catch them in pitfall traps, but we can't put radio tags on them. So we do know that they're the most important dispersal agent of these animals, and they can go miles, and they are the ones that colonize new pools, which is why it's important to have a network of wetlands and other vernal pools in any area with a vernal pool. And our studies have shown us some other things. So here's the wood frog, and we had done, I was talking earlier with Suzanne, we had done studies on wood frogs 15, 18 years ago down in the Mount A to the C area and in Wells. And we put radio transmitters on them and followed them around. And we got the impression that wood frogs spend their summers in forested wetlands. And we've done a study in suburban Bangor to see, those were, quote, wild animals because it was all very forested. We put them in a suburban environment to see how they navigate in suburbia. Every different colored line is a different frog. Each point on the colored line is where we got a fix on the frog. And we learned a lot of things about how frogs use suburban developments through this research. The vernal pool is over here, and they're emanating from the vernal pool. And I'll give you results of that in a minute. But we also, I told you that we learned in central and southern Maine that wood frogs are using forested wetlands. Well, a colleague of mine who's a consultant said, well, yeah, but what do they do in the mountains? So we went to the Western mountains and studied wood frogs there. Each point is a fix on a wood frog. We discovered, as you can see, here are the breeding pools. Well, who knew? They go up the mountains for the summer. So this is a whole different thing. How do we conserve wood frogs in montane regions? It's not the forested wetlands. So I'll tell you a bit of what we learned about that. And then the other important life history phase is where they hibernate. And this is a wood frog. They dig a shallow little hole and they cover themselves with leaves and they mostly freeze solid. And you are skiing over them, walking over them. They are very close to the surface. And we studied those. A student put a fence around them to see when they go down and to keep track of snow conditions, when they come out, and what condition they're in when they come out. So what did we learn from all this research? We learned that these animals travel quite a long ways, and these numbers are median, so half go less, half go more, and these are just the adults. And this is just in Maine. So we have over 3,000 feet maximum for the wood frog. You can look at those numbers. They're in the hundreds of feet from a pool. Keep this in mind for when we look at what our regulations do. We know that they use complex habitats. And what we mean by that is they have complex life histories, is that they don't spend the winter in the same place they spend the summer, and that each species uses a little bit of a different habitat. So when you're trying to come up with a regulation, how do you encompass all those needs of these animals? Some are in forested wetlands, some are on mountaintops, some need well-drained forests. So knowing that they have these complex needs, it definitely drives home a landscape scale approach, because look at all this intervening land between where a wood frog spends its summer, where it goes to breed, and where it goes to overwinter. So obviously, if we're putting roads in development between those life history habitats or post-breeding habitats, we're going to have some consequences. So one of the things we learned from the urban study that was very interesting, if you're a homeowner, is that they moved through hedgerows or any sort of cover that you have in your lawn. So it's very important to make connections with hedgerows or cover to the nearest forest. They use wetlands as rest stops, so it's good to keep wetlands vegetated and free to reduce chemicals. We lost a lot of animals to lawnmowers, sewer drains, and pets. And they need to be able to get to their hibernation sites. So those are just a few things we learned from the suburban study, that there are things a local homeowner can do to have an amphibian-friendly yard. We have trouble with road salts, obviously, causing diseases and bloating in wood frogs. So, if we can have extensive conservation areas with frogs with limited roads, that's going to be good. Changing climate is a big issue. Common winter thaws. The wood frogs, I told you, mostly freeze solid. In the beginning of the season, if they thaw and freeze, they have enough glucose reserves to make it through that. But if they thaw in the middle of the winter, they do not have the reserves, and they've used up their energy, and that is likely a mortality event. So when we have lower snow insulation and thaws, we're losing a lot of animals coming out thinking it's spring, and then they freeze. Even the salamanders who don't freeze, they hibernate below the frost line, are coming out and then they freeze. So a lot of the variation in numbers of egg masses in pools is actually owing to winter mortality. Changing climate, we're having drying happening sooner and egg masses being left high and dry, and we have pools that are also drying sooner after the breeding season. So there's all sorts of reasons for mortality events. The other issue with human development is fidelity, meaning most frogs and amphibians go back to the same pool from which they hatched because they know that that's a successful pool. That's where they came from. It must have the right hydrology. So I have colleagues in Rhode Island where pools have been filled, there's been pavement put on it, and they're still getting amphibians coming back and laying eggs on the pavement. So we need to consider that. It's not as easy as saying, we'll fill this pool, but we'll build another one somewhere for them. Same thing with the hibernaculum. It's very hard to follow a frog through the winter because the radio transmitters run out. They're very expensive, and we don't put multiple transmitters on an animal because it's too stressful. So we've only followed 2 completely. But what's fascinating about that is they were in meters of their hibernaculum. So it looks like they go back to the same place to hibernate as well. These animals are very tied in to what is their home base. So meaning they don't want to be moved around a lot. So impacts to amphibians, changing hydrology, which leads to the summers and early pool drying, changing conditions, which are fostering diseases, winter thaws. And then, of course, the synergistic effects of fragmentation on amphibian fitness. What that string of words really means is that just like when we're stressed, we tend to pick up viruses and things more easily because our whole system is down. if we stress out amphibians with lights, pets hunting them and so forth, they're more likely to pick up ranaviruses and diseases that are already in the environment that they did not used to be so susceptible to. So this all sounds like a nightmare, but there are some things that we can do as caring citizens. We know that duration of flooding is important for animals. For example, fairy shrimp can finish their life cycle in 6 weeks, so they can be in the most transient of pools. And then wood frogs are the ones that take the less time to develop of all the amphibians. And then we have the salamanders, which generally need a longer hydroperiod pool. Now, what this ought to say to you right away is that we need a variety of pools with different hydroperiods. You hear some people say with climate change, should we only be conserving, the ones on the higher end of the scale? We don't really know what's going to happen. Here was a study done by some folks looking at ways to photo interpret with LiDAR vernal pools. But really, I wanted to show you this slide because it shows a landscape full of vernal pools. And I'm a real proponent of conserving different hydroperiods in the landscape. This paper is very interesting. At some point, if you want to look at it, I can get the citation, but they identified all these pools with LiDAR and then did field testing, and it showed that the LiDAR was much better at predicting where pools were. The red is where they did field testing and they came up with negatives to show that it really does work. So the good news is more and more mapping tools are going to be available for helping us to find pools, and then we can plan better at a landscape scale. One of my other suggestions is let's think about including alternative habitats. They're not obligate breeders. There's plenty of amphibians nesting in beaver flowages where there's plenty of refugia from fish. So we need to think about a holistic landscape with different kinds of wetlands and connectivity to vernal pools. Slow moving streams through forested wetlands. We've got blue spotted and spotted salamanders will lay eggs in the underbanks of these areas. So we have to think more broadly about habitat needs and connecting them. And here's the really fun story from the mountains. Who knew? This wood frog, and my student who worked on these, Luke Groff, followed a lot of wood frogs to the top of these mossy boulders, spending the summer up here, smothered in moss and eating invertebrates, and also spending the summer in the rows of water that develops along the boulders. So these become important habitat features. And he also found a lot in beaver flowages. So I hope what I'm doing is dispelling the image of just vernal pools, realize that these animals' habitats change depending on their context, and that we need to maintain a number of hydro periods and kinds of wetlands in a landscape. So this is a forested wetland. It might not be a vernal pool, but these are important summer refugia. They can also serve as vernal pools. So that's a different way of looking at this, and it seems really complex, but we had an idea, and that's what I'm going to share with you now. Landscape scale approach. Here's the current regulatory framework and why we think it isn't the only thing to work. I don't want to replace this. This is great. It got vernal pools on the radar screen. These are good regulations and they're a starting point. The federal area of concern is roughly 750 feet around a pool. The state concern is 250-foot zone wherein you just need to get a permit to be allowed to develop. And if the pool is owned by multiple landowners, each landowner can get a permit to develop a quarter of their section. So as you can see, that's not real solid protection for animals that are using this much land. Remember, we talked about greater distances. So those subset of pools in the state of Maine are called significant vernal pools, and they're based on egg mass numbers of each of the species. But if two people own a pool and I'm going to develop on my side, I can't count the egg masses in the other person's property. So you can see that these are really legal definitions, and for long-term viability of these species, we need to come up with something more locally oriented. So that state regulation encompasses less than 20% of all pools. The other issue is that 250-foot permit zone, the amphibians have no regard for the law and they often travel way out beyond that permit zone. So it could be developed all out here and all that has been regulated is in here. So you see there's a problem. So the makeover is fairly simple. We had a community vernal pool mapping program that was completed in 2000, the Wells Reserve a while ago with me. She was one of our first volunteers and a fabulous volunteer. These are all the towns that we mapped all potential vernal pools using community scientists. And we assessed them only on lands where people gave us permission, but there are maps available for these towns of potential vernal pools and of ones that we were able to assess. So that was great. Those towns all had a digital map, but towns are busy and those maps sat in the cupboard until when? Well, until there was a development proposed and the planning board would pull them out and look and see if if they needed to get a state permit or a federal permit. So you can see that we did all that work. We did a lot of education. Vernal pools became well known, but we weren't getting conservation on the ground that we had hoped for because, of course, towns don't have a lot of time to do this on their own. So we came up with a new approach that is local. We call it eco-based because it takes into account town economy and ecology. It's predictable and flexible, which the developers like, because if you're a developer, you've got federal regulations that are different from state regulations that are different from local ordinances. It's a very frustrating environment to be in if you're a developer trying to work your way around wetlands. So this special area management program I'm going to tell you about is all of those things, and it's proactive. So the way that we did this is we got together as a group. This is a special area management plan. It's an Army Corps tool, and it's for managing sensitive natural resources. And vernal pools fall under that umbrella because they're hard to map, they're ephemeral, and most people don't know what they are. A special area management plan has to consider economics, and the plan itself includes policies and mechanisms for implementation. So this was a 7-year meeting. It took us 7 years to meet, over 100 meetings with a various array of stakeholders. We all had one thing in common. We were not fond of the current regulatory environment for vernal pools. Everyone for different reasons. The ecologists because we felt it didn't do enough. The developers because it was complex, complicated, and unpredictable. Nothing like bringing people together than having a common enemy. So here's who our stakeholders were, which is why it took 7 years. The typical people, the federal, state agencies, the towns, the people in orange are the first time we've brought people together to discuss this. The important people, economists, developers, planning consultants, the other side, so to speak. How do we work this out so it works for everybody so that towns can be vital while doing conservation so that local landowners can be remunerated for conserving their pools? We decided to start with 2 towns, Orono and Topsom, because they were both willing and they were both part of that mapping project. And we developed this alternative mitigation tool. It's been approved by the Army Corps and the DEP, so you don't have to go through both agencies if you have adopted the SAMP. And it's available to all New England towns, so even other states, this tool is available. I don't have time to go through the whole tool, but I'm going to give you the gist of it. If you have a comprehensive plan in a rural and a growth area, if you look at this map, all the vernal pools are on the map. And this designated growth area is a subset of the growth area where you have lots of services and infill is needed. And that's where the SAMP applies. And as you grow out in your growth area, you can extend the extent of the SAMP, okay? If you don't want to use the SAMP, you go back to the default state and federal regulations. So this is a voluntary mitigation tool for vernal pool impacts. So the way it works is if you're a developer, the town has a SAMP, you know that you can go in here without getting a permit. You can impact the pool. You pay a fee. And with that fee, those monies go to a rural landowner to conserve pools in the rural area where a certain amount of land and connectivity to other pools can be had. So what we're doing is we're taking money, making development more attractive and easier in the growth zones, and actually providing a tool to remunerate rural landowners who are willing to put conservation easements on poolscapes. That's it. It's way more complicated, but that's a whole nother talk. So here's how the money works. A developer pays a fee that is the appraised value of her land with and without a pool. So it's worth more without a pool. With a pool, value has been taken away. We take 40% of that difference, goes through the town. The town gives it to a third party, which is a land trust. And the land trust can do that to work conservation easements with rural landowners. Land trust has 3 years to disperse this money. If the land trust can't find a rural landowner that's willing, there's no penalty to the town. It just goes to the state in lieu fee program. So there's no liability for the town. Community outcomes are certainty and predictability. Compact development, because it's really encouraging infill in those growth areas. It's really encouraging using up all the area that's within town services. It supports municipal visions for rural lands. In Topsom, for instance, where our key vernal pool landowners were, matched the green spaces that the land trust was going after. So they were managing to have seed money to put on the table for fulfilling their greenscape that they already had in mind. And I like to highlight that the green areas or these poolscapes really are wildlife landscapes, because you saw how important they are to the forests. You don't think of these as this is just a vernal pool conservation plan. This is an idea for how we conserve wild, or at least as wild as we can be, landscapes in developing areas. So we're providing space for ecosystem processes to work out, for plants and animals to move across the landscape that's changing with climate, to allow for connectivity among pools and wetlands, which we know are used by birds and mammals and reptiles and all sorts of things. So I see this, I got in the door through vernal pools because I'm very interested in forested wetlands, but and that's where the money was. It wasn't, nobody wanted to put money into amphibians. So my point is that this is an overall open space plan for smart planning for as much wildlife as possible. Remuneration for landowners and conserving pools in a landscape context, not with cookie cutter circles around them, which in the long run are not going to support our animals. And people are upset, well, what about the vernal pools that are in the urban areas? Well, guess what? They become lovely urban wetlands. They'll have frogs in them, they'll have turtles in them, but they will not support in the long term vernal pool amphibians, which need adjacent habitat that's accessible for hibernation in the rest of their life histories. So my developer friend who worked on these with me tells me that most developers don't want to pave over the pool. They just want to be developed up to it. And a lot of them like to leave them as urban wetlands. So there's that to consider. It conserves connectivity. So that was a lot in a short time, and I'm hoping I left plenty of time to talk, because there's lots to talk about. This is our website of Pools and People. There are ecology, vernal pool identification PowerPoints that are annotated, a lot of publications, Kids Corner, management and regulations want to get involved. So I would take a look at that. And the special area management, there's a whole tab on the special area management plan. There's a PowerPoint that describes it in more detail. And we have a very readable booklet that's available by PDF, and it's a how-to for the towns that want to get involved. And finally, we saw these signs, my husband and I hiking, and we thought, this is cool, farmland forever, certified organic raised, you know, the Farmland Trust has these. So we figured, you know what, we need one for vernal pools. So if your organization or your land trust or a citizen does a conservation easement, they can probably display something like this. This land conserves vernal pool wildlife. So with that, I will stop sharing so that I can look at all of you. And I think how come I can't see everybody? Did I stop sharing?
No, you're still sharing.
Okay, it says that, oh, here we go. There.
There we go.
Okay. Great. We still have time for plenty of questions. I'd love to hear from you folks. And I'm sorry if that was too fast. I just wanted to be able to give you a little bit of everything.
Thanks, Aram. We do have one question in the chat from Jermaine. Is brackish water a non-starter for breeding? No salt, question mark.
Brackish water as in an estuary, or brackish water as in salt impacted vernal pools? Is Jermaine still there to answer that question?
Yes. Jermaine, feel free to type in the chat or come off mute if you want to clarify. And maybe Jermaine stepped away, so.
Okay, so I'll answer it both ways then. Brackish waters are, I would like both ways, okay? Brackish waters are pretty much a non-starter, although I had a graduate student working in Acadia, and she actually had successful breeding salamanders on the upper level tide pools that only got salt spray once in a while. A very small amount of salt is a tonic to amphibians, but they do not breed in salt marshes or estuaries. Roadside salt in pools. There have been many papers on this. It is a detriment. It's not a non-starter. They still breed in them. They come out less fit. So road salt is a serious problem. A moderate amount of salt, maybe, but not the way the roads are being salted these days. There are some watersheds that are low salt watersheds, and those are definitely better. So I hope I answered that. We don't find them breeding in estuarine situations, and road salt is a problem. It may not be an immediate mortality event, but it reduces fitness. By fitness, I mean it reduces the health of the amphibians, the developing larvae, and the adults, but particularly detrimental effects to the developing larvae and eggs.
I have a question.
Yes.
My name is Debbie Landry. I'm working with high school kids in southern Maine to evaluate rivers, streams, and wetlands. And we're trying to give classrooms the technology to study organisms using eDNA. And I was wondering, have you been using eDNA as a proxy for finding out what organisms are in various pools?
So this is great. There is a graduate student whose committee I'm on. His name is Harrison Goldspiel, and he is studying eDNA in vernal pools. And if you send me an email, I can get you in touch with him. And I work with the GMRI doing that, students evaluating pools. Well, he is now doing programs. I got him to do programs for them too, with teachers and students. So I know that Harrison would love, maybe he would even come and talk to your students in Zoom or something to get them excited about it. So he is investigating that. If we could use eDNA to see if fairy shrimp are in pools, or to see if the rarer blue-spotted salamanders are in pools. He's asking such questions as, can you evaluate abundances from eDNA, not just presence, absence? So that's fabulous, and he'll be a great resource for you.
Would you say, this is a follow-up question, would you say that the fairy shrimp are sort of your best indicator species in a pool, or is there not really one you can?
No, there's not one, Deb, because they all have different hydrologic needs. So I can tell you just from years of experience looking at vernal pools that I find more fairy shrimp associated to riverine pools for some reason. I have much better luck finding high densities of fairy shrimp along streams and rivers. I do not know why. But no, what they're a good indicator of is hydro period, not value of a pool. From my perspective, I never believed that high species diversity means higher value. Think about a parking lot with all kinds of weeds in it that has high species diversity. I think more of habitats being important that host specialized species. So if I have a vernal pool and all it has in it is fairy shrimp, why, that's a fantastic contribution to a landscape. So wood frogs can be successful in places where the mole salamanders can't.
Yeah, from your talk, I got that sense that these are pools to pools are very different based on their location and hydrology.
That's why your work is so important. If you're getting students to realize that rivers, streams, and wetlands are connected, and a lot of species use those different things during different parts of their life histories. We know from our work in Acadian National Park that the amphibians breeding in beaver flowages where there were refugia from fish migrated to their other habitats along slow-moving streams. They used those as safe, moist highways to get to the forests that they were going to spend the summer in. So you're teaching it just the right way, not as isolated units. But if you do email me, I think you'd love talking to Harrison. He'd help you.
Yeah, the difficult launching step is the primers. Just getting those primers, and then you're all set. So
that's right.
I will definitely be contacting.
Okay, good.
For him. Thank you.
We have another question in the chat, but I wonder first if you can just clarify eDNA for folks who might not know what that means.
I'd be glad to. eDNA stands for environmental DNA. All organisms shed skin or scales, or as they decay and die, they are also leaving behind genetic information. And it turns out that DNA is a very stable molecule, and depending on where you find it, some types of reservoirs of water are very good at keeping the DNA around for a long, long time. Soil is also a great way to study what lives there, but water is fascination and is easier to actually extract the DNA from.
Thank you, Debbie.
And the real utility of it is we don't have to wait for a certain time period, wait for egg masses or wait for animals. They can just get the samples and figure out quickly who's in there. And they can do it with invertebrates even. Yep.
Anything at all.
There was
We've been doing some eDNA research at the Wells Reserve on crabs and fish as well. So.
Yeah.
But Stacy, let's see, has a question. Is the original This Land Conserves Vernal Pool Wildlife graphic image copyrighted, or is it open for other states to edit, reuse, and repurpose? We respect the copyright.
Yeah, Stacy, I don't know the answer to that. It's on my webpage. If you go under the SAMP and town things, you'll find it there. We developed it and paid for it, but we want it used. So I don't think we copyrighted it, and we'd be happy for other people to use it. And I'm, what state are you, is Stacy there? What state are we talking about?
Hi, this is Stacy. Thank you so much. I'm actually with NOAA, and I'm working federal, but we work across states. So I work very closely with Suzanne.
Yeah, so I do not believe we copyrighted it. We're happy to have it used.
Wonderful, great. I'll reach out for more information. Thank you so much.
Excellent.
Are there other questions from the group? I don't see any others in the chat. Oh, here's one. Another one from Debbie. Are the town maps of vernal pools found on a website?
No, they're not. I think we have copies of those. I think that I'm not sure why they're not on a website, but I think if there were a town that you were interested in, you would approach that town. All of these maps were done by Stantec. And I have a graduate student who has the map. So if there's something that you're interested in, we can probably get those files to you. I believe that they haven't even been incorporated in completely into the IF&W database either.
Any other questions from the group? And while folks are thinking, Aram, maybe you could put your email in the chat. It went quickly with the slides, so in case folks
okay
get...
would the slides be available to people?
I am recording this, so the recording will be on the Wells Reserves YouTube site.
Okay, that's my email in the chat, and if you need any follow-up, that's where to go. Do I have a prediction for big night this year? Depends on where you are. And even in my town, it depends on aspect of the pool and degree of forest over it. My area, the greater Orono area, and is generally the animals move around tax day. But, the down east coast goes sooner, is sometimes as early April even. But again, it depends on, like, from pool to pool, there is no one answer to that. So in my own town, I have a pool out back. I'm in Amherst, Maine, that is 3 weeks behind another pool in town that's in more open area. So what I suggest to people for big night is to find a pool that you know locally and watch it. And if there's a pool that's deeper in the forest, it's going to be later. But there is a listserv that tracks the popping of pools across New England. I think that the first gentleman on was Clayton, had that listserv. I don't know. I'm not following that. It just stresses me out when they come out because there's so much work to do.
Can I share that with you, Suzanne, and then you put it out to the people on?
Sure.
Or put it in the chat, Clayton. That would be great. Put it in the chat.
I don't have it readily available. I have my email turned off to reduce my bandwidth, and that's where I would need to go to get the listserv information.
Pools popping in Maryland. I don't know the answer to Stacy's question, but one place to go is a state website, and whatever the state has for its IF&W analog, fisheries and wildlife analog might know. I would be surprised if Maryland didn't have such a thing.
Stacy, once she gets the information on this listserv that I subscribe to, she could put a question there. I mean, there's a great group of people on it that are really good about sharing information.
Great. Yeah, I can forward that along to folks when you email it to me, Clayton.
Okay. I'll get that to you right after this.
I just found one.
Oh, yep. Deborah,
is that the one?
Debbie found it.
Oh, great. All right, so it looks like it's in the chat there.
Thanks, Debbie.
Well, that's fun.
I have a question. I'm wondering when the wood frogs are hibernating underground and, we're skiing and walking over them, how do we have any detrimental effects in that sense, or are they deep enough that it's okay?
Usually with snowpack and everything and leaf litter. I mean, I can't say that there aren't times when people have squished wood frogs because it must happen before the ground freezes, but I don't think you're detrimental to them.
So going off trail in the winter.
I wouldn't
okay.
worry about that. I wouldn't worry about that. I do worry about these odd winters we've been having. I think of last winter as the winter of ice, where my forest floor was just covered in ice and they don't get out in time to breed. It's very hard to come out from under ice as opposed to a snowpack. So just another thing to worry about, but I wouldn't worry about squishing wood frogs.
Okay.
Does anybody have any comments? Not questions, but perhaps comments.
Oh, we can't hear you. Is it Emlyn?
Well, and Brittany also has a question.
Oh, I didn't see Brittany's.
Oh, it is. I'm sorry, it is Emlyn. Emlyn.
Oh, great. Yeah. Put it in the chat. That's great.
I don't see it yet.
It's coming. And while we're waiting for that, I'm curious about just big night adventures. Has anyone helped salamanders or frogs across the road during those mass migrations? Yes, Catherine.
Yeah. Sometimes you can see leopard frogs and spring peepers during those migrations as well. Some of the early ones. It's kind of fun. It's a good chance to get to see a leopard frog. They breed sort of in between the wood frogs and spring peepers in the next group of frogs. So they're pretty early breeders and they get missed a lot. Then followed by the pickerel frogs. How a community starts a landscape level approach. Oh, okay. So from my perspective, the SAMP is the best way for a town to start conservation of vernal pools, and that those acknowledgement awards we like to use for landowners who put their land into conservation, or land trusts who are involved in that as well. The SAMP it has a number of things that a town has to go through to adopt the SAMP officially. It's all laid out in the webpage, and the towns of Topsom and Orono who've already done it are willing to give advice and help, as am I. So if there's ever a town that's interested, I'm happy to come in person and talk to the town council, talk to the Conservation Commission, talk to the planning board, whoever and whatever you need. I'm willing to come in person and do that to get you started. But take a look at those materials on the website, and that'll help you figure out what this really is. And as far as mapping goes, any town that's already got those base maps that I showed all the towns who had participated has enough to start the SAMP. That you've met your requirement there. If you're a town that is unmapped, probably the only place that would need to be mapped is the rural area to show that there are pools for using in the rural area. And the more towns you do together, like if Mount A to the C were to do all the towns together, there's a great discount in photo interpretation by having contiguous towns in one set of imagery. I hope that answers some of those questions.